Flags across the Washington, D.C. area are being floated half-staff tonight as leaders remember Senator Lindsey Graham. His office says the South Carolina Republican died after a brief and sudden illness. Tonight, the medical examiner says the senator died of an aortic dissection due to an aortic rupture stemming from a hardening of Graham's arteries. Graham served in the U.S. Senate for more than 2 decades and became one of President Donald Trump's closest political allies. Tonight, tributes are pouring in from fellow lawmakers, White House officials, and those who knew him best. One of his neighbors out in Washington says he was known as a friendly, down-to-earth presence in that neighborhood. A bouquet of flowers were left outside of Graham's Washington home as neighbors remembered the longtime senator. One of them says Graham was simply just a good neighbor who always took the time to say hello.
He was always very nice. I actually probably saw him more at political events over the last decade or so than actually just living not that far from him. So if you didn't see him on TV or know he was a U.S. Senator, you probably just would have thought he was a regular nice neighbor.
Reactions are pouring in from several White House officials as well as former presidents, too. Joe Biden saying he and Graham often disagreed, but one thing they did agree on was the importance of public service. Vice President J.D. Vance describing Graham as having a sense of humor and loving the game of politics. Many tonight sharing they were shocked and saddened to hear about his death. Tennessee Senator Marsha Blackburn also reacting to that news tonight, saying he was a devoted public servant and devoted his life to serving the people of South Carolina and his nation. She adds her prayers are with his family, friends, staff, and those who loved him. Also tonight, Senator Bill Hagerty has issued a statement of his own, saying he was a dedicated public servant and a strong voice on many issues. Congressman John Rose also posting this message you see here on social media, saying he appreciated the late senator's commitment to America first and his willingness to take tough questions from reporters. Senator Graham was 71 years old.